This FedGov Today program is sponsored by HII Mission Technologies. On this edition of FedGov Today, a new source to add to the data deluge. The need for speed ramps up at the Pentagon and the value proposition for records management. Welcome to FedGov Today in Washington, D.C., on YouTube, and around the world on the American Forces Network. I'm Francis Rose. The Department of Veterans Affairs says it's taking a data approach to its records management and governance process. The agency says that requires reframing how it thinks about and handles its records. Moya Hill is Chief FOIA, Privacy and Records Officer in the Office of Acquisition, Logistics and Construction at VA. At the Public Sector InfoGov Summit in Reston, Virginia recently, she tells me how the agency is doing it.
At VA, we're reshaping records into a data asset by ensuring that records is the foundation of information governance. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and the Privacy Act. So records right now, the records management program is the foundation, which means the file plan and the record schedule, we're using it as a way to ensure that the FOIA officers have access to the records that they need, and the privacy officers have access to records that, sensitive documents that will protect sensitive information. In doing so, because the record schedule is used as a way to ensure that records are kept from disposition, to ensure that the records are kept in a way where we know when they're supposed to be disposed of and how long they're kept. So if that is the foundation, FOIA officers have a way to understand, hey, this is when we need to dispose of the records, and privacy officers have a way to understand when we need to dispose of sensitive documents.
Is that the trickiest balance in the records management business between privacy and accessibility? Folks should have access to what they should have access to, but they also shouldn't have access to what should be kept private to protect an individual?
That's a good question. It's a healthy balance because, oftentimes FOIA officers release documents, right? That is their job, is to release documents. And privacy officers, that is their job, to protect the sensitive information within those documents. So that's why I preach collaboration. Mm-hmm. Collaboration is very important because if they're not talking to each other, then, mistakes can happen, and we're trying to avoid that at the VA.
What are the governance best practices that you've seen to not just to walk that balance, but more broadly about moving records to a data asset, as you talked about a moment ago?
That's a very good question. So what we're doing at the VA, at OLC specifically right now, we're ensuring that information governance is at the forefront. And we're using the information lifecycle model. And so we're trying to ensure that records management, FOIA, and privacy principles are embedded into the information governance cycle, because that will allow us in OLC to be proactive to ensure that all the data for veterans are protected. So if we ensure that FOIA, privacy, and records management principles are at the creation of an information all the way to disposition of that information, then it will be successful.
Were there any best practices, any policies, procedures you had to put in place to build out to make sure that idea of the life cycle concept was mature?
Absolutely. So at OLC, we are using the OLC information governance framework. So within that framework, again, we ensure that information is governed from the creation to disposition. Because if it's not governed in that manner, there are so many instances where challenges can occur. For example, we could have privacy in FOIA, we could have an increase in backlog, or in privacy, we could have an increase in privacy risk. And so by doing so, we're ensuring that information is governed at every stage of information lifecycle to reduce all those challenges from occurring.
Mm-hmm. What are the challenges and the risks, the upside and the downside that you're seeing of the different ways that people can now communicate with each other? Email, collaboration tools. There are all kinds of channels that people can use both within the agency and communicating with constituents of the agency. What's that mean for the way that you're managing records and then making them available to people?
I love that you say that, because right now we're living in a digital age, right? And so, SharePoint, we're living in an age where we're using SharePoint, we're using Microsoft Teams, we're using share drives, and we're moving away from documents or records being in file cabinets, and we're moving into a digital way. So if we're moving into digital way, we have to ensure that information is accessible. And not just that, but we have to protect it because of privacy. At the forefront of what we do are veterans. We have to make sure that we properly provide transparency to our veterans while we protect their personal data.
Who are your biggest partners across the agency? Who do you work most closely with to deliver on the mission that you're talking about? A lot of collaboration, it sounds like, and a lot of technology pieces, I imagine, that are moving around.
Yes, that's a great question. Besides FOIA officers, privacy officers, and the obvious records officers, we have to interact with IT. IT is very important because, again, we live in a digital age and we have to understand that. So by incorporating and collaborating with IT, we're able to ensure that the information is protected. It's transparency is being offered because in FOIA, that's our number one mission, but also privacy is being protected at all costs.
What are you working on now as far as things that might be challenging to you in the future, but maybe aren't today? The proliferation of data, as we just talked about, you have more records coming in, I imagine, than ever before. Automation tools that are going to be available to you. Everybody wants to talk about AI or think about AI as a potential solution to lots of different problems. What's kind of over the horizon that you think will be important to you at a future point?
So at OLC, while working at OLC, the number one thing I realize that's important is, like you said, AI, right? But the only way we can use AI is we have to think about AI in a way where it can assist in transparency, assist in protection, and assist in really records management and accountability. So in creating a information governance software or information governance program, with that being the focus, FOIA, better access to information, privacy, better way to protect the data, and records management, better way to ensure that information is disposed of properly and is retained according to NARA guidelines. AI can come and assist that. AI can be the assistant tool that's needed to ensure that records management keep these records in line with NARA guidelines. Privacy have better access to protect personal data, and FOIA have a better way to access this data to provide better transparency to veterans and the public.
What would you like to see the privacy side and the FOIA side, the accessibility side, do to maybe collaborate more closely together, to work more tightly together?
That's a great question. So as we know, FOIA provides access to government information and privacy protects personal data. Collaboration is necessary. Collaboration is key. When a FOIA officer releases a record, a privacy officer should be right there with them to ensure that that personal data within that record is protected.
What are you seeing those two sides doing among themselves to drive that collaboration, to make sure that remains smooth? It's one thing for you as the leader to say this is how we expect it to be. It's another thing for those folks to actually pick up the gauntlet and make it work.
That's a great question. The first thing that I would recommend is privacy officers and FOIA officers not only collaborate, but they need to consult with their records officer. Why? Because records officer is the foundation of it all. Records officers govern and manage data using the records retention schedule. With that schedule, they can tell you how long the record should be kept. They can tell you when to dispose of it. And that's very important because if a FOIA officer release a record, you want to make sure that not only privacy information, sensitive information is protected, but that you're not releasing documents that should have been disposed of.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a lot in this conversation so far about strategy and conceptually. Tactically, how is technology changing the way that you actually hold the records and the way that you actually dispose of those records? In a digital concept, it seems like it's completely different than it probably was 15 years ago when a lot of stuff was paper, and after a period of time it went to a shredder somewhere and that was the end of it.
Right. Well, this is where AI comes in. And we're seeing a lot of AI, like, for example, Copilot. Back in the day, there was no real way to really help you along besides reading, but AI can assist in so many ways to let you know, hey, this is how long this record should be retained. This is how long this is when this record should be disposed of. So really utilizing these technologies that are out here, these innovations that are out there are really going to help our records officers or FOIA officers and our privacy officers govern information properly, because at the end of the day, information governance is what we should be focusing on.
Moya Hill of VA. You can read more about records management on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the need for speed ramps up at the Pentagon. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
Innovation doesn't wait, and neither do we. At Maximus, we solve problems, streamlining operations, delivering solutions at speed and scale that drive measurable results. From strategy to execution, we simplify complexity, building trust through expertise and innovative technology. Every service, every time. Efficient government delivered. We don't follow innovation, we drive it. Maximus.
What's different today is software as a service, where you get a system that's delivered out of the box to you without any bolt-ons. Your data is unified and it's all in one place, so that you no longer have to ask for data and wait on a spreadsheet, right? It's right there, right at your fingertips.
Making data integrate and actually work for the workforce, as opposed to data helping just the technical side of business, is fundamentally a different shift. And that's absolutely the power of what I think we're talking about today.
Welcome back. 5 new portfolio acquisition executive organizations will be what the Navy calls, quote, the new operational standard for the acquisition enterprise, injecting urgency into the acquisition system. The PAE concept aligns with Pentagon Secretary Pete Hegseth's acquisition reform model. Gary Schwartz is Chief Operating Officer at HII Mission Technologies. Gary, welcome. It's great to have you here. Just about every person I talk to, civilian or uniform, in the building now says, we want speed, we need things faster in the hands of warfighters and so on. What's driving that in your view?
You know, the big headline was Ukraine, right? And all the drone activity there and the way that both Ukraine and Russia iterated against each other. And so that just drew a lot of attention, not just to drones, but to speed in general. Plus we have the added push of, the department is saying we're on a wartime footing, right? So when you're on a wartime footing, slow is not a word you hear very often, right? So I think getting things in the hands of warfighters to counter the threats, to iterate faster than they do, and oh, by the way, do it in a way where that cost to effectiveness ratio hits the right mark.
What does rapid fielding look like in the field? What are the warfighters that need stuff? How are they getting it in a way that comports with what the Secretary talked about in this acquisition reform effort?
So you see a lot of efforts like this of how do I get things quickly designed, prototyped, and into the hands of warfighters, not because it's the final answer, but because it's the first in a series of steps, right, to get to a better answer, right? And in fact, the Army has taken some approaches where they want to skip past a lot of things and never bring it out of the lab except to have the soldiers try it, put it back in, rinse, and repeat the cycle and kick it back out again. So I think fast in the hands of warfighters is the warfighters actually being able to help drive where the development of that weapon system, sensor, whatever it is going. What's your sense of what you and your colleagues in industry can do to help the department iterate faster, given how contrary that is to the way that the DoD has done things for so long? Yeah, and I'll even put a plug in that not all traditional defense companies are hampered or unable to move fast. So, for example, the approaches that we're taking at HI is about how do I get to agile design and engineering. I do minimum viable products. I kick them out. I iterate a lot. I get a lot of feedback from the warfighters, right? How do I have tools that allow me to digitally check things ahead of time, model-based system engineering kinds of things, digital environments? How do I make it so that the soldiers or the other customers, the warfighters that are, bringing the resources, how can they contribute to it while you're building it, right? You've got to show them things along the way. The old days of what they called the waterfall, when you sort of give me the requirements and I'll show back up in a couple of years with the answer, Those are gone.
Yeah, and it's striking to me, everybody tells me too, that the warfighters are not shy about giving you in industry and their counterparts in the department feedback on what works for them and what doesn't, right?
Exactly. And in fact, we've had some success stories, like example, we have what they call the Remus 620. It's a medium underwater vehicle, unmanned underwater vehicle. We brought that from concept to prototype. That's kind of the terminology we like to speak. Concept to prototype in a year. That very same system has continued to evolve and now was the very first one to actually demonstrate the ability to be launched from a torpedo tube and then be recovered to that same torpedo tube. And we've got a lot of other systems like that. So, we're not alone out there trying to move fast. We get the message. We just got to convince the Department of War to let us, some of the standard defense companies have a shot that we hear it and we're moving fast.
We have about a minute left. What feedback do you want to get from the tip of the spear when you're designing a system like that, working on a system?
They'll give you quick feedback on, is it effective for the mission? Is it usable, right? Can a mere human use it, or do I have to bring the PhD along to make it work? I mean, those are some of the things that, typically you can't get unless you're getting in front of the warfighter.
Gary, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for being here today.
I'm glad to be here.
You can read more about speed and acquisition at the Pentagon on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the value proposition for records management. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
TrackVia modernizes work processes with a secure, easy-to-use solution to track and automate operations in one place. From staffing and tracking large projects, and to managing facilities, assets, and compliance. Teams can modernize processes instantly, work online or offline, and generate accurate reporting without added IT burden. Ensures confidentiality, integrity, and availability ideal for government CUI data in the cloud. One system replaces many. TrackVia. Modern, mobile, mission ready.
Welcome back. Agency inspectors general and the Government Accountability Office have long lists of recommendations for federal agency leaders to manage their records and data better. The President's management agenda, the Evidence Act, and other policies and law provide agencies with incentives too. Sterling Thomas is chief scientist at GAO. At the Public Sector InfoGov Summit in Reston, Virginia recently, he explains why the leading practices around data and records are so important.
Well, in this kind of modern age that we are in today, the information itself is tremendously valuable. And so we've moved from where a lot of agencies are really focused on, implementing their missions through actions, which still happens, but a lot of missions are heavily data dependent, heavily records dependent, because we're trying to learn from the way we've done things in the past, but also adopt new technologies, bring in new ways of thinking. Think about the age of AI. There's a lot of automation, analytics, and AI that can be tremendously helpful to American citizens, who depend on the missions of these agencies. And data makes it possible for us to do a better job and to do it faster. And so that's kind of the transition that a lot of folks are heading in.
Are you seeing agencies thinking about records as data or thinking about data as records, or is that just maybe a semantics exercise that I'm thinking a little too hard about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends on the agency. The nice thing about GAO, where I sit, is that we're in the legislative branch. We really help Congress oversee what's happening in the executive branch, so we get a broad view of what's going on. And I think you see agencies where it's kind of, they're making that transition to records or actually data. And there's other agencies that have totally gone over is that records, data, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter to them. In the end, it's a piece of information that they want to then mine to do a better job.
As you see agencies invest more and more in AI and analytics, how are the ones that are doing it well, and the ones that are falling short, how are they falling short, and what do you advise them to do differently?
Yeah, so the agencies that are doing it, that is a great question. Agencies that are doing it well are approaching it from a thoughtful perspective. They see the value of AI. And it's not just AI, it's data analytics in general. It's an entire practice. AI is kind of one of the most modern tools, but there's a lot of tools that can do just as good a job. But they're approaching it from a concept of, okay, I want to understand how to do whatever process better or more efficiently, or maybe even take it out of the hands of one of my analysts or workers and give them the freedom to do something else that is more valuable for the agency in serving their mission. And so they're approaching it from, how do I make this tool do what is best for what we need to do for the American people? Agencies that are a little further behind sometimes get a little over aggressive and just kind of throw AI at everything, and they'll end up with a solution that doesn't actually do what you want it to do, and will then have to abandon it. And it's not, I mean, that's not bad. I mean, they've learned an important lesson, but it is not as effective as sitting down and thinking, how do I make this tool do what I want and serve our mission? And so, at GAO, we try to provide that guidance to agencies through the frameworks that we provide, as well as the oversight and programmatic reviews that we do, to try to help them understand how to implement AI and make it effective cost-wise, but also the most important part is the mission to serve the American public.
So I'm going to read between the lines of that answer. What it seems to me was included in the first group that you talked about, the organizations and agencies that are doing it well, that wasn't included in the second group, is they're thinking about this from a workforce perspective too. How's this going to affect the people that we have? How's it going to help them do their jobs better? How is it going to free them to do things that we wish they could have done before, but they haven't been able to because they were doing these tasks? Yeah. And the second group, it sounds like, is not thinking about that. Is that a fair read on my part?
I think they're thinking about it, but they're not sitting down and thinking through the entire problem. And they're saying, oh, there's a tool, everyone's saying it's exciting, let me throw it at a problem, without sitting down and understanding the problem and saying, is this the right tool? And it's a different style, but in the end, what appears to be coming through, and we'll really have a good feeling on this when we finish our analyses of these programs, is when you thoughtfully think through the problem, apply the tool that actually matches the problem, you get a much better answer.
So you have agencies have a proliferation of platforms too that they're gathering data from. Yeah. Used to be a big stack of papers, and now there's email, and there are collaboration tools, and 8 million different ways that agencies are receiving and transmitting information. What's the implication of that? Not just for the digital tools that we've talked about, but just for holding the actual records, managing them, and then disposing of them when the time comes.
Yeah, and so at GAO, we approach this from a systematic approach, a systematic view. And I think you see this in successful agencies as well, where we look at all of these, again, as digital records. We have a records governance model that tells us how do we store them, how do we mark them, for how long we have to maintain them for statutes. Additionally, how do we mark them for future analysis? So one of the exercises we're going through recently is how do we, when we look at the way that we do our work, and our work is broken up into essentially things Congress has asked us to do, which tend to be programmatic evaluations or financial audits or science and technology assessments and all the things that we do. Each one of them is kind of its own individual project. How do we mark records so that a tool can look at the huge collection of data we have and pull out the information that's specific to that engagement, is what we call it. And so there's a tremendous kind of tagging and maintenance of this tagging process that makes a lot of these tools available that before didn't really exist, because it used to be, oh, this is email. The statute says I have to keep email this amount of time. Email is all stored here, and we'll have a cleanup process that happens when that statute time limit ends. But now it's, well, we have all these emails that came in from experts associated with this particular question that Congress has asked us to do. How do we mark that so that analytics tool over here knows to include that in its broad analysis process? It's exciting because all of a sudden you're like, I can bring in all this data that before was heavily siloed, but that tagging and marking process is complicated, but can be done with a good data governance process.
Is automation going to help that too?
Absolutely, yeah. Automation is important. I mean, we can't do this all by hand. Mm-hmm. And so you have to automate it based off of key terms and lots of other technologies. So you're kind of heading down the road of what does that technology stack look like that I'm sure people are tired of hearing about because it's been going on forever, but that is a reality, is you have these analytics tools in the end that you want to be able to process all of this data from lots of different data repositories or silos, we'll call them. but they're being brought in recently because of different rules that have relaxed those silos, but also advantages we want to bring in with AI and machine learning. And so bringing all that information in, you can't physically mark it. So now we have to go up the stack and, okay, what tool can we use that uses natural language processing or some other technology to identify which records are actually appropriate to be included in this analysis? And then a cleanup. There has to be a human in the loop to say, this was done correctly and this was not done correctly, and continue to improve that process.
We have about a minute left. There are a lot of things in the pipeline technology-wise that will help in this way. What are the things that you think are going to be most helpful to agencies that are struggling now to manage all this?
I mean, from the technology perspective, it's going to be continued improvement and kind of the implementation front end. So how do you early on when AI first kind of became available to the public and left where it was before, they were still pretty tough to work with. You had to have a pretty well-educated staff, who could build these systems and build these models. The companies that produce these machine learning and AI tools now have built a pretty complex kind of front end that allows lots of different types of users, highly technical users, as well as more less technical, more process-oriented users to be able to implement these tools. As they become easier to implement, I think you'll see a proliferation. Additionally, kind of the AI agent is a great concept that's coming out today, because now you're building, instead of building tools that were designed for essentially everything, these are tools that are very smart and intelligent in a particular area, but also have that flexibility that didn't exist in machine learning tools, so that it can adapt to some variations that are within the realms of allowance. Those are powerful tools as well. So now you don't have to have one tool that fits everything. You can build tools to the specific process you're trying to solve.
You can read more on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in just a moment.
The other thing, through all of this, you can't be afraid to try. We have to constantly innovate, fail fast, pick ourselves up when the project wasn't that great, and not, I always use the term that one of my mentors used when I worked for him, stop admiring the problem. Try something, try and solve it. It's okay if it doesn't work. Try something else. And I think we're seeing more and more of that on the federal side to move a lot faster.
We look at new AI capabilities. A rule of thumb when my team's working on a new AI capability, a new tool, if you can't get to 80% in 20 minutes, maybe you want to move on. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of low-risk things that can be done that have high value, high efficacy, reducing the cost for defenders, increasing the cost for attackers, really winning that economic warfare of cybersecurity.
FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10. You'll learn about DARPA's new angle on renewable energy for the Pentagon. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week.